I think it's an important thing to understand about about MMT. We're not promoting particular government programs that come alongside the money that the government introduces. We're just telling you that the economic machine cannot function. You cannot have full employment. You cannot pay your bills on an aggregate scale individually, everyone in the entire economy. If an insufficient amount of money is injected vis-a-vis the taxes that people have to pay. This is something that I think it falls on deaf ears with people like them, and I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't really. There's some blind spot, but
Well, I think I know what the blind spot is, and we've discussed this before, is that there's a basic set of assumptions. And if you take, and for simplicity's sake, let's say there's the Austrian basic set of assumptions and there's the MMT basic set of assumptions. If you take what we're saying, like what Nima just said right now, and you apply that to the Austrian set of assumptions, what Nima said makes absolutely no sense. However, if you take it with the MMT set of assumptions, it makes perfect sense. The question becomes, which set of assumptions are more accurate? And if we can't have a discussion of starting about, okay, what are the assumptions that we're working with? We split off into these two. I mean, honestly, they're kind of like two different economic languages. The translation doesn't go through, right? Me and Nima, we understand both the Austrian and we understand the MMT, so we understand the language that they're trying to speak. But we're trying to teach them a new language, and they're not getting it. And it's not just that they're not getting it. I don't think they accept the fact that there is another language to learn, right?
correct.
And the set of assumptions, I think we've boiled this down, is barter theory of money versus credit theory of money, and the economic equilibrium. Those two things. So the Austrians assume the barter theory of money, and they also assume that there's such a thing as an economic equilibrium in between supply and demand of any given thing. They take those two assumptions, and then they go to, okay, let's start applying philosophy, which is where they get this, okay, there's the initiation of the use of force, and these are the things that happen, and here's what happens when the free market does stuff. So you have government on one hand, which screws things up, and free market on the other hand that does things without the initiation of the use of force, and they build a house on top of the assumptions with those two things. Now,
And they come to economic conclusions.
They come to economic conclusions, and what I've found is that when I start talking MMT to a Austrian or even a neoclassical guy, is they think I'm arguing with their philosophy.
Right.
Which is whether or not the initiation of use of force is bad, or whether taxation is theft or not.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to get out. That's a good thing to get out of the way. We disagree that taxation is theft. We agree that taxation is theft. We agree that voluntary choices trump compulsory choices. We agree that the government is evil and gigantic and dangerous, does all kinds of dangerous things, and the more money is at their disposal, the more dangerous they get. So we agree with all these things. We want a small government and a large private sector. We agree.
We want lots of freedom.
Lots of freedom for the individual.
We want everybody to be rich.
We want everyone to have Mercedes and villas, exactly, mansions. So we agree on those philosophical ideals. Can we somehow get an acknowledgement on that? No, I guess it never really can, because this person blocked us. So, I mean, we must be really horrible people in his view. But we agree on all these things. We want a small, tiny government. We want a large private sector. We want maximum voluntary choice, no compulsory choice. What we disagree with is the methodology of how we get there. What we disagree with is the interpretation and the analysis of how the monetary system works. Because in these people's minds, there is a certain stock of gold that we start out with in the private sector, where people have chosen to use gold for their transactions.
Or silver, doesn't matter. Yeah.
Gold or silver. The government comes in and starts taking some of the gold to do their programs, and then they start issuing paper money on top of the gold and make the gold currency irrelevant, introduce fiat money, and then they start printing money out of nowhere, right? That then
Now there's more money than gold, so it's
as more,
counterfeit in quotes. Yeah.
and they're issuing bonds to raise more money out of nowhere, which then the future generations have to pay off those debts in the form of higher taxes down the road. So it then siphons off resources from the private sector more and more, and gives more and more power to the public sector. That's sort of the Austrian viewpoint, and it all starts, as you said, with the barter theory of money. That first we traded seashells for rocks, and in a long, drawn-out process, humans realized the best media of exchange are the most durable, most homogeneous, most fungible. All these attributes that gold and silver have, and over time, these media of exchange win out. And then we have this perfectly voluntary free market and money and everything. And then the process that I just described ensues. The
The big
government
government comes along and says, "We
comes
need
up,
some of that." Yeah.
right, and messes it all up. If right, so if this was the case, then yeah, we would be in agreement. But unfortunately, we observe that the capitalist economy that we're in today, and even the agrarian economies from 5,000 years ago, have never functioned like this. There's never been a process where gold and silver competed against seashells and rocks, and then they became the perfect media of exchange. Blah 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 blah. The monetary system always started out as a fiat system. In fact, the earliest records we have are from the Sumerians, where the Sumerian kings would impose a tax that is payable in a certain token, and then the public would so they would spend that token into existence to hire the public for public works programs. And now there was demand in the private sector for these tokens because they were acceptable in tax payments. Yes, there have been periods where these tokens were issued to commodity values such as grains in the case of Sumerians, etc., but the government was printing the tokens.
I want to add a note to that here, real quick, in terms of the grains, because I have had this comeback, which is to say, okay, yeah, but the Sumerians, their money was actually measured in grains. So they had silver and they measured it in grains of rice. So it was actually a commodity of grain, and they used the silver. Well, yes, it may have started out because grains are very, very important, right? But as we're going to see here with the tobacco example, as we go down this Twitter conversation, is you see this interesting relationship where, okay, everybody talks about paying things in grains, but at the end of the day, most payments aren't made in grains. Let's break that down, which is to say, okay, the priesthood, which is the government back in the day, says, okay, you owe 1,000 or 100 bags of grain or whatever, right, for your taxes this year, Nima. And Nima doesn't grow grain. Nima has sheep. He has fruit. Whatever. And so where is Nima supposedly supposed to get this grain? Well, the barter theory says, well, he goes and barters with Dylan because Dylan has the grain. And what actually happens is that the government says, okay, this is what everything's worth. Not because the market decided it, but they said, okay, sheep, that's worth 10 bags. Fruit, 1 bag of fruit is worth 3 bags of grain. A slave, depending on, is a male slave, is a few, they set the prices. Mm-hmm. They said, this is what everything's worth. It had nothing to do with the market. Now, once they set the prices, it's not that you're trading grain. It's just that was the original thing that it was measured in. And so, okay, Nima's got the sheep. He brings it in. That's worth 10 grain. He might get a token that says this is worth 10 bags of grain, and then he can go trade that token. So even though the conversation kind of starts about grain, because that's really the most important thing to feed everybody, in reality, the money becomes that token. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really, really, really important distinction. Like, there's a flavor of barter in here, but when it comes down to the functioning of the economy, it's the token that's the really important thing.
Yeah, and Carlos Rios just commented, and he said that sounds like communism, and that is kind of somewhat accurate, actually. oldest monetary economies were kind of communistic. Ironically, they weren't. The free trade wasn't there first. Is our point.
Right. When the
Uh,
king conquers another thing, they're not like, okay, how do we set this up so everyone has the ability to have freedom and maximize their quality of life? No, they're
the
like, how do I get tribute?
Yeah, the free market was a corollary of the military conquests of the Romans and the armies in general, because supplying and being in charge of supplying an entire army on your own is a pain in the ass. So what did they do? They told the soldiers, you conquer this territory, you get this token as a reward, and we will demand this tokens as a yeah yeah. So he agrees with that. Libertarians seem to assume that the market was always free. Right. No, I mean, the free market was an outcome of military conquests, right? You have soldiers get rewarded in some token. Let's take the most extreme case, and I invent a token called Nima bucks, and I tell the soldiers, hey, go to that territory, conquer it, and I'll pay you Nima bucks. The soldiers will be like, well, what are the Nima bucks worth? Then I tell them, well, I will tax the territory that you cover. I call it Nima Stan, and everyone owes me 10 Nima bucks per week. So the soldiers understand now that, okay, there's going to be a demand for this token. We will be able to purchase stuff from within the private sector because all these people need this token to pay this tax that you've now imposed. So now I don't have to be in charge of producing all the stuff that these people need, the soldiers need. Feed the horses, feed the soldiers, shelter, training, etc., etc. They can go on the free private market and obtain those things. So the private market was basically an entourage. The free market was an entourage to the emperor's military conquest campaigns in the past.
Well, and I think it's worth pointing out how deviously clever the system is, right? Because I mean, there's a bunch of steps in the middle, but if you look at the beginning and you look at the end, this is just a violent transfer of resources from the private sector to the public sector, but the private sector doesn't feel that, right? They just go, how do I make money?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I need to start a business. I need to get a job so I can make money. I mean, yes, I got to pay this tax. I don't like the tax. But what ends up happening, like Nima just described, is that the soldiers get services from the conquered people in this example. But, you know, they conquer, and instead of just straight up saying, oh, we're going to confiscate everything, which I'm sure they did that too, but hey, let's set up the system where you work and there's this market, and the market goes back and forth. But like I said, at the very ends, the structures created by the government that has the violent authority to demand the tax, it creates the arbitrary token out of nothing, gives it to the soldiers for their work, and then the soldiers are able to exchange it with the local population, in quotes, the market, so the local population can pay that tax. So the money is completely made up, and the mechanism is resources go from private sector to public sector.
Exactly.